This is the story of a woman who lost everything and still chose to show up. In a snow-covered town called Riverbend, a schoolteacher named Eliza Carrington stood in the eye of her own storm, widowed, forgotten, and one breath away from giving up. But this isn't a story about giving up. It's a story about what happens when you choose to light a fire, even when the world tells you to let it die. About quiet strength, slow love, and the kind of hope that doesn't roar. It whispers. If you've ever stood alone in the cold, this story is for you. Let's begin. The wind didn't whisper that. Day in Riverbend, it howled, loud and angry, like it was mourning something. It came off the hills in waves, clawing through the narrow streets, rattling windows, slamming shutters, and finding every crack in the wood to remind the town just how cold the world could be. And in the middle of it all stood Eliza Carrington, alone, coatless, in front of the little schoolhouse at the edge of town. The children had gone home long ago, scarves trailing behind them like faded flags, boots crunching through fresh snow. Eliza had told herself she stayed behind to clean the chalkboard. But the truth? She just didn't want to go home. Because home wasn't really home anymore. It was a cold, silent cabin at the edge of the woods, a place where her husband's coat still hung by the door, untouched. A place where the quiet wasn't peaceful. It was unbearable. The kind of quiet that pressed in on you and made your memories louder than any storm outside. 6 months a widow, 3 months without pay, alone, forgotten. That's where she was. But she still showed up every day to teach. She could have taken help. The women from the church came by last week with baskets of food and warm blankets. She thanked them, but turned them away. Not because she was proud. Pride had been buried with Thomas, but because she had made a promise. And in a world where so much had been taken from her, that promise was one thing she could still hold on to. She told Thomas, before they lowered him into the frozen ground, that she'd keep the school running, that she'd be there for the children of Riverbend no matter what, even if the snow never stopped falling, and that's exactly what she did. Now I want you to think about something. What does it take for someone to keep going when everything else says stop? No money, no warmth, no help, just a promise, and a memory some people break under less, but Eliza, she chose to endure, not because she wanted to be a hero, not because she was stronger than everyone else, but because she refused to let the storm take everything from her. Sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is stay standing, not fight, not shout. Just stay. It's easy to look at someone like Eliza and say, that's just a story. That's just fiction. But I don't think it is. I think most of us at some point have stood at a window with the world howling outside, wondering how we'll make it through the night. And if you're in one of those moments right now, maybe this story isn't just about Eliza. Maybe it's about you, because this isn't the end of her story. It's just where it begins. So don't go anywhere. The storm may be strong, but so is the woman walking through it. And sometimes, all it takes is one step forward to start finding your way back to the light. By the time Eliza Carrington reached her cabin that night, her hands were numb. The kind of numb that doesn't just sting, it sinks into your bones. The wind had turned sharp, biting, relentless. She fumbled the key twice before the lock finally gave way, and when she stepped inside, it wasn't any warmer. The firewood was gone, the fireplace cold, the silence in the room familiar and unwelcome. Thomas's coat still hung by the door. She didn't need food or rest. What she needed, what she feared, was this, the weight of being alone. And that's when it came. One single knock at the door, firm, measured, intentional. She froze, heart climbing into her throat, because no one knocked in the middle of a blizzard unless they needed something, or unless something was wrong. "Miss Carrington," came a voice, low, steady from the other side of the wood. It's called her Roar. She knew the name. Everyone did. Owner of Roar Cattle Company, a veteran, a man who lived further out than most and closer to danger than anyone else. the kind of man people respected or avoided. "What do you want?" she called back. "Firewood," he said. "And a meal, if you'll have me." When she opened the door, he stood there like a monument to the storm itself, coat crusted with ice, face carved by wind, one arm holding a sack of chopped wood. "I heard about your situation," he said. "Didn't come to pity you. Just thought maybe we could help each other. No offer of salvation, no judgment, just truth." And that's what made her step aside. He said little, just moved to the fireplace, stacked the wood neatly, struck a match, and coaxed a flame to life. Eliza stood across the room, arms crossed, still wary, still watching. "You've been watching the schoolhouse?" she said. "I have." "Why?" "I wanted to see how long you'd last." It was blunt, unapologetic, the kind of honesty you either walk away from or match with your own. "I don't need saving," she said, voice firm. "I didn't say you did." And in that moment, something shifted. Two people standing in the wreckage of their own pasts, both stubborn enough to still be standing, both too proud to say what they needed, and too human not to feel it anyway. Later that night, over stale bread and weak broth, they sat by the fire. Calder told her stories of cattle trails, of wolves in the high hills, of losing a brother in war and a wife to fever. Eliza told him nothing, but somehow he understood anyway. Before he left, he placed a small parcel on her table. Flour, coffee, a wedge of cheese. He said he'd be back. To check on the children, he claimed. Or maybe to see if her pride had thawed. And as the door closed behind him, Eliza realized her hands had stopped shaking. Outside, the wind still howled. But inside, the fire burned steady. Two strangers, one storm, and a question that still lingers. What if help doesn't come in the form of rescue, but in the quiet offer to stand beside you while the storm rages on? This wasn't love. Not yet. But it was the start of something that had the shape of hope. And sometimes, that's enough to keep a fire going through the night. By the end of that brutal week, only 3 children showed up at the Riverbend schoolhouse. 3, Mary Goodwin, whose father had broken his leg out in the barn. Polly Talbot, wearing his older brother's boots stuffed with paper to make them fit. And little Sadie Flynn, who hadn't said a word since her mother died the month before. They stood shivering outside in the snow like brave little soldiers waiting for orders. Eliza saw them and felt something break and rebuild inside her at the same time. She lit the last of her kindling, taught math by candlelight, held Sadie's hands in hers to warm them. And when the fire burned out by noon, she kept reading from Little Women anyway, even though her voice was shaking and her fingers were stiff with cold. "We've got the key to our castle in the air," she read softly. "But whether we can unlock the door remains to be seen." That's when the door opened again. And this time it wasn't the wind, it was Calder roar. His boots tracked snow across the floor, his coat was heavy with ice, and his tone left no room for argument. School's closed. Eliza stood slowly like someone waking from a dream. "Who says?" "I brought the wagon," he replied. "Blankets, hot water, room for 3. The families know." They agreed. Polly had already grabbed his books. "You should have consulted me," she snapped. "I did," Calder said calmly. 3 days ago. You just didn't listen. That cut deep. Not because it was cruel, but because it was true. She had been so focused on surviving. She forgot that sometimes help doesn't shout. It waits. She stepped aside. Let the children go. And for the first time in weeks, she stood in an empty classroom, cold creeping back in through the cracks. That evening, Calder returned again. Uninvited. Again. But this time he didn't bring wood or food. He brought a contract, room and board, a salary, a warm place to live, a classroom built from the bones of his old ranch library. 10 children scattered across the county, all too far from town, all hungry to learn. "Why me?" Eliza asked, barely able to believe what she was holding. Because you didn't quit, Calder said. Not when everyone else would have. That hit her harder than any storm ever had. She wasn't being offered charity. She was being offered a purpose, a chance to teach, not just out of survival, but because she was good at it, because someone believed she mattered. That night she sat by the fire, contract in her lap, Thomas's coat still hanging silently on the hook. And for the first time in a long time, she whispered a word she hadn't dared to speak aloud. Please, please let this be real. Please let this be enough. Please let me matter again. And just 2 days later, Eliza Carrington stood at the front of a new classroom. It smelled like sawdust and coffee and fresh hope. The walls were lined with oil lamps. A blackboard hung between 2 windows. 10 small desks, hammered together from old crates, waited for their owners. And then, footsteps. Laughter, the clatter of boots and the rush of snow-soaked scarves. 10 children burst into the room. Dirty-faced, wide-eyed, curious, wild. Are you really a teacher? One boy asked, eyes round. I am, she said, brushing snow off his shoulder. Just in a different room. They picked desks at random, chattering like birds. They didn't know her past. They didn't carry her pain. They just showed up, expecting to learn. And Eliza? She picked up a piece of chalk. Let's begin, she said. And just like that, a new chapter opened, one where winter didn't win, one where fire, once nearly gone, had found kindling again, in laughter, in children, in second chances, and in a woman brave enough to say yes when the world offered her more than survival. There's something about teaching children that strips away all pretense. You can't fake warmth. You can't disguise fatigue. Kids see it all. They feel it. But even in the coldest weeks of that long winter, Eliza Carrington never let the fire in her classroom or her spirit go out. The children she taught weren't polished or proper. They came from the hills, the ranches, the dust. Most of them wore clothes stitched too many times to count. Some couldn't spell their own names, but could saddle a horse with their eyes closed. Others had never been inside a real schoolhouse, until now. But they were hungry, for knowledge, for structure, for someone who looked them in the eyes and believed they were worth teaching. And Eliza did just that. She learned their names, praised their efforts, showed them how to hold a pencil, how to find pride in small victories. She wrapped cold fingers in hers when the mornings were brutal, and never once let them feel like they were less than. And while she was building up the children, someone else was quietly building something for her. Calder Rohr didn't say much. He never had. But his actions filled the silence like poetry. Every few days he would arrive with a tray of food, thick stew, crusty bread, mugs of milk warm enough to thaw fingers. He'd set the tray down, nod once, and disappear before anyone could say thank you. Once he brought a blanket, deep blue wool hand-stitched with red roses blooming across it. Eliza held it carefully. Your wife made this? She asked quietly. He nodded. Catherine, she believed in warmth, even for strangers. And somehow that was all he needed to say. It wasn't just food or fabric Calder brought. It was space. It was the freedom to breathe again, without pity or pressure. A kind of companionship that didn't demand anything in return. Just presence. Just quiet support. Isn't it strange how connection can grow not in grand gestures, but in the small, steady things? A repaired desk. A quiet look from across the room. A moment when grief and grace sit side by side without saying a word. Their relationship didn't come with declarations. There were no romantic fireworks, no sweeping confessions. Just 2 people, carrying invisible burdens and slowly realizing they didn't have to carry them alone. It was a different kind of love, the kind that grows like firelight, slow, steady, without smoke or sparks. But it warms you just the same, and maybe that's the kind of bond that lasts, because when someone sees you not for what you've lost, but for what you still have left to give. That's not just kindness. That's healing. Eliza had come to the ranch to teach, to survive. But as the days passed and the children laughed louder, as the snow softened under spring's approach, she started to believe in something more. Not just hope, but home. And it didn't come all at once. It came in layers, like frost melting on a window, or light creeping in through an open door. Sometimes the most powerful connections are the ones that say the least, and stay the longest. It didn't start with a scream or a fall, just a cough, a sharp, ragged sound carried faintly from somewhere near the barn. Eliza had just finished sweeping the schoolroom, her hands still dusted in chalk when she heard it. At first, she thought it was the wind. But then it came again, lower this time, like someone trying to hide it. She stepped outside. The sky had gone steel gray again, and snow drifted across the yard like smoke. That's when she saw him. Calder, doubled over by the horse trough, one hand gripping the rail, the other pressed to his mouth. When he looked up, his face was pale, his lips cracked, and there, across the wool of his coat sleeve, blood. "You're bleeding," she said flatly, already moving toward him. "It's just a cough." He tried to smile. "I'm fine." But Eliza had heard that before. Different words, different winter, same lie. She didn't ask. She didn't argue. She just took his arm, half guided, half dragged him toward the house where she stoked the fire, pulled blankets from the bed, and pressed cool cloths to his forehead as the fever took hold. "I've done this before," she said quietly. Calder didn't answer. He just looked at her with those storm-colored eyes, trying to stay tethered to something that made sense. "My husband, Thomas. He got sick the last winter we had together. Fever came fast. 3 days from the first cough to the last breath." She didn't tell Calder how she'd sat beside him for those 3 days, whispering nonsense, praying in silence, holding on to a hand that grew colder by the hour. She didn't say how she'd buried him alone, because the ground was too frozen for anyone else to help, but maybe she didn't have to. Because Calder reached for her wrist, not roughly, but firmly, like he needed to anchor himself. And he said just 4 words. "I'm not him, Eliza." She met his eyes. And for the first time since Thomas died, she believed it. Because Calder wasn't trying to take Thomas's place. He wasn't offering her a new life to replace the old one. He was offering her space. A place to put down the weight she'd been carrying for so long she'd forgotten what it felt like not to. Later, when the fever broke and he could speak clearly again, he told her something that settled between them like falling snow. "I built the school for Catherine," he said. "My wife, she was a teacher too, strong, stubborn. She kept going long after the fever started. Collapsed in the snow on her way home." He looked toward the fire. "I built that classroom for her. But I couldn't open the door. Not until now." Eliza felt her breath catch. Because sometimes grief doesn't stop your life. It just locks a part of it away. And you walk around it for years not realizing it's still there, waiting to be touched or healed or let go. "You didn't open it," she whispered. "No," Calder said. "You did." That afternoon, the children brought her drawings of snowmen, horses, dreams. One had sketched her and Calder sitting together, a fire glowing between them. She smiled despite herself. Later that night, she found a parcel by her car, new boots, soft gloves, a book of poetry, no note, no signature. But she knew. And without knowing exactly when it had happened, Eliza realized something had shifted. The storm hadn't stopped, but it no longer lived only outside the walls. Because sometimes, the fiercest storms aren't the ones howling through the trees. They're the ones you carry inside and finally, quietly allow someone else to help you weather. Small towns remember everything, even the things you never said, especially the things you didn't do. By the time Eliza stepped into the general store that spring, the gossip had already beaten her there. "She's living in his house now," whispered one voice behind a barrel of flour. "Teaching his children," said another. She doesn't even wear black anymore. It wasn't what they said that hurt. It was what they assumed. That because Eliza had found warmth again, she must have given something up. Her mourning, her morals, her name. She stood in the next aisle, back straight, hands clenched around the strap of her basket, pretending not to hear, pretending she hadn't already heard it all before. Because shame doesn't come from the truth. It comes from being misunderstood. She still wore Thomas's watch, still said his name in quiet moments. But when she looked at Calder roar, she didn't feel like a widow anymore, and that terrified her. Back at the ranch, Calder was in the barn, sleeves rolled up, hay clinging to his shirt. He looked up the moment she stepped in, catching the color in her cheeks, the tension in her jaw. "What happened?" he asked. "Nothing," she said too quickly. He walked to her slowly. "Talk." She hesitated. Then finally, quietly, she said it. "They're saying I've taken your name without earning it, that I've stopped grieving too soon." Calder's jaw tightened. Then, without ceremony, he reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Not a ring, a contract. Her name at the top, his at the bottom. Marriage, by law, by record, but built on her terms. A separate room. Full authority over her school. No obligations beyond what she chose to give, no claims to her freedom. Only protection from a world too eager to decide her story for her. "This will protect you," Calder said softly. "Your reputation, the children, the work you're building." "And you?" she asked. He shrugged. "I've lived under scrutiny since Catherine died. I'm not doing this for me." There was no proposal, no kneeling, no flowers, just a simple offer. A name, not as a possession but as a shield. She looked at him for a long time before she answered. "You've already given me food and work and shelter," she whispered. "And now you want to give me your name." "I want to give you room to breathe," he replied, "and a place where no one questions your right to be here." The marriage was quiet, no guests, no rings, just a worn Bible, Reverend Whittam, and Mrs. Chen as witness. Eliza wore a green dress, the only one she owned that wasn't black. Calder looked at her like she was sunlight after a long snow. When the Reverend said, "You may kiss the bride," he didn't. He just touched her cheek with reverence, not romance. That night, Eliza sat by the fire in her own room, marriage certificate tucked neatly beside the book of poetry and Thomas's watch. Outside, snow drifted slow and soft again, as if winter had one more breath to offer. Then came a knock. She didn't flinch. "Come in," she said. Calder stepped in with a small pot in his hands, a rose bush, barely blooming. "Fragile. It's not spring yet," she said. "I know," he replied. "But I thought maybe you were ready for something to grow." She took it with trembling fingers. "I don't love you," she said suddenly. "I don't know if I can." "I'll wait," he said, "even if it never comes." She looked down at the rose, one small bud pushing through cold soil, and for the first time in years, she wanted something more. Maybe love doesn't always start with lightning. Maybe it starts with trust, respect, and a name spoken without shame. Spring doesn't always announce itself with flowers. Sometimes it comes as a quiet drip. Snow melting off a rooftop, one drop at a time. The trails through River Bend, once impassable with ice, had hardened into muddy ribbons. Smoke curled gently from chimneys again, and the hush of winter slowly gave way to the murmur of life. Inside the schoolroom, laughter had returned. Children kicked off their gloves, traded stories and drawings, and greeted Eliza with a familiarity that felt like home. There was tea now, Mrs. Chen's idea. Warm mugs handed out with calloused hands, passed from desk to desk like little cups of comfort. The fire burned steady, the windows held strong, and Eliza Carrington was finally at peace with being seen. One morning she found a drawing tucked inside her lesson book. Rosa's work, of course. There was Eliza, standing before the blackboard, the fire glowing behind her. In the corner, in careful block letters, the child had written, "Our new teacher, she makes the cold go away." Eliza didn't cry. Not then. But something in her chest softened, like ice pulling back from the earth. Later that week, as she stood near the fence watching the children race sleds down a muddy hill, Calder approached from behind and placed something gently on the porch. Railsea clay pot, dark soil, tiny green shoots barely pushing through. A rose bush. "Isn't it too early?" she asked. Calder shook his head. "Maybe, but I thought you were ready." There wasn't a card, no ribbon, just a seedling quietly asking for a chance. She took it into her arms like something fragile and full of meaning, because it was, because in the dead of winter, Calder had brought her warmth, and now, in the stirrings of spring, he was offering her something more than comfort. He was offering her a future. But Eliza had one truth left to speak. "I don't love you," she said softly. "Not yet. Maybe not for a while." Calder didn't flinch. "I'll wait," he said, "even if it never comes." That kind of patience, that quiet, steady kind of love, was something she'd never known, not even with Thomas. And it scared her. But it also calmed her in a way nothing else had. That night she placed the rose bush by the window where the morning sun would find it. And for the first time in a long time, she let herself dream of things that hadn't yet bloomed. Because sometimes spring isn't a season, it's a choice, to thaw, to begin again, to let life return in its own slow, stubborn way. And Eliza Carrington, once a woman frozen in grief, had begun to bloom. The child came on a warm April morning, the kind of morning where the air is still crisp but the light feels different. Brighter, gentler, like the earth is finally exhaling after holding its breath all winter. Rosa was the one who ran to fetch. The doctor. Mrs. Chen boiled water, laid out blankets, whispered calm in 2 languages. And Calder. Calder never left Eliza's side. He held her hand through every cry, every gasp, every aching heartbeat. And when their son arrived, red-faced, wailing, utterly alive, Eliza wept, not out of pain, but because life had found her again. They named him Thomas James Rohr. Thomas for memory, for the man who taught her how to love and grieve with grace. James for strength, the kind you carry quietly, the kind that doesn't break under weight. And Rohr for home, not the place, but the feeling Calder had built around her, one day at a time. The first bell of the spring semester rang out a week later. Children poured through the schoolyard gates, laughter echoing down the valley. Their boots kicked up dust where snow had once been. Their voices filled the air like birdsong. Eliza sat on the porch of the schoolhouse, her newborn in her arms, Calder's arm wrapped around her shoulders. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The silence between them had long since turned into something soft, familiar, sacred. This woman, who not long ago had stood alone in a frozen classroom, coatless and unpaid, was now the heart of something, bigger than she ever imagined. To the children, she wasn't just a teacher. She was a symbol of what could survive the cold. She was living proof that the things we lose don't always stay lost. That the world, even when it breaks us, has ways of piecing us back together, if we let it. Later that day, she looked down at her son, kissed his forehead, and whispered, "You were born from winter, but you are made of spring." Calder turned. To her then, voice low and full of something that didn't need explanation. "I told you I'd wait," he said, and she smiled, "and I told you it would be worth it. We don't always choose our storms, but we can choose what we build after them. Sometimes all it takes is one act of defiance, lighting a fire when the wind says don't bother, teaching 3 children when the rest have gone home, saying yes, to love when grief has told you never again. And in the quiet corners of the world, in places where wind still howls and frost still bites, people like Eliza Carrington remind us what it means to hold on, to choose softness in a hard world. This wasn't just a story about survival, It was a story about rebirth, about love that doesn't need to shout, and about a woman who walked into the storm and came out carrying light. Eliza Carrington didn't defeat the storm, she simply outlasted it. She loved slowly, lived bravely, and built something beautiful, not out of what she had, but out of what she chose to believe in. A classroom, a family, a future. So if you're standing at your own frozen doorstep, unsure of the next step, remember this. You don't need to be fearless. You just need to move forward, even when your hands are still shaking. And maybe, just maybe, spring will find you too. If this story spoke to you, share it. Someone out there needs to hear that they're not alone in the snow.